On a freezing night in the Pacific Ocean, a cruise ship carrying over 500 people sends an urgent mayday call. A fire has grown out of control, and hundreds of elderly passengers are about to abandon ship as a typhoon heads straight towards them. The call triggers one of the largest air-to-sea rescues in modern maritime history. But as rescuers race to reach them in time, a deeper problem emerges. The Prinsendam was only built a few years earlier and was supposed to be one of the safest ships at sea. So how could it end up in this predicament? This is the story of the Prinsendam's infamous final voyage and how it almost ended in catastrophe. As evening fell on October 3, 1980, the Prinsendam was sailing through the Gulf of Alaska towards the East Asian coast. The previous few days had seen the cruise visit sheltered ports and popular tourist spots such as Glacier Bay National Park. But this leg was different. The ship was beginning a 4,000-mile crossing of the North Pacific Ocean, with no scheduled stops along the way. As the vessel passed through Alaskan waters, nighttime temperatures could fall close to freezing, and they weren't much higher during the day. So the ship's largely retired passengers faced at least a week of sailing through cold and potentially rough seas, far from the nearest major ports if something went wrong. But the Prinsendam was judged to be an extremely safe ship. Built for Holland America Line, it had passed a U.S. Coast Guard safety inspection just a year earlier. This was despite a minor fire breaking out in the chef's quarters during a voyage around the same time. Similarly, an engine fire had delayed the Prinsendam's entry into service during sea trials. But the ship's design still met Dutch standards, which were stricter than international regulations in some areas. Unaware of the Prinsendam's history of fires, the more immediate problem passengers face is the crossing itself. As the vessel pushes further into open water, dinner service is unusually quiet. Many passengers skip the meal altogether, remaining in their cabins while they wait for seasickness pills to take effect. Several hours later, the ship is around 120 miles away from the Alaskan coast, and most of the passengers and crew are settled in for a rough first night at sea. Meanwhile, Assistant Engineer Robert Kalf carries out routine maintenance down in the engine room. One of his jobs is to change the fuel filters of the ship's low-pressure fuel system, a task he's completed hundreds of times before. At approximately 12:40 a.m., Kalf replaces the filter without issue. But as he walks away, he hears a loud bang behind him. Startled, he turns back and sees a 4-foot jet of diesel fuel spraying directly onto a hot exhaust pipe. Seconds later, the fuel ignites. Kalf and nearby crew members rush to fight it using handheld extinguishers. At first, their priority is to stop the fire from spreading across the room, but the situation rapidly declines. The burst fuel line is spraying diesel across the space, feeding new flames faster than it can be put out. As the engine room fills with heat and smoke, the crew are forced to shut down the engines, leaving the Prinsendam dead in the water. Needing more drastic action, an engineering officer alerts bridge staff, who wake Captain Cornelius Wabeck in his quarters. The captain has more than 30 years' experience at sea, and he's commanded the Prinsendam for its entire time in service. Knowing the ship inside and out, he rushes to take command as the fire below intensifies. At approximately 1 a.m., Captain Wabeck reaches the bridge. He's met by the sound of blaring alarm bells and anxious senior staff awaiting orders. One of those on duty is the chief radio officer. With over 500 people on board, the officer is ready to send an emergency distress signal at the captain's command. But Captain Wabeck instructs him to send out an urgent Morse code message instead. The transmission is picked up by Kodiak Coast Guard Station. After learning about the ship's condition, the station requests that the Prinsendam send a full SOS signal at once. Given the time of night, most crews in the area would be sleeping, so they also asked the crew to activate the international auto alarm signal. Once triggered, the signal will ring bells in the radio rooms and officers' cabins of nearby ships, reducing the odds of the distress call being missed. But sending a full SOS comes with a caveat for Captain Quebec. Under maritime law, any vessel that helps save the Prinsendam can claim a salvage reward from Holland America. These financial payouts can be very expensive and place huge responsibilities on captains, as a wrongfully declared emergency can have serious career consequences. With this in mind, Captain Quebec hesitates despite the urgency of the situation. He eventually orders the radio officer to hold off on sending the alert, thinking that his crew can contain the blaze. But the radio officer refuses.
If I lose my license, get fined, and go to jail, at least I will be alive, and so will the passengers and crew, God willing.
After a heated exchange on the bridge, the officer sends a full SOS, requesting urgent assistance from anyone nearby.
Tell me what you heard from the Prinsendam.
Just SOS. This is the Prinsendam, and passenger ship on fire. Engine rooms on fire, and situation unknown.
As the cry for help goes out, desperate reports come back from the engine room. For the better part of an hour, the captain and senior officers have been trying to assess whether the fire can be contained manually, but their hesitation has given the blaze time to grow. And now, the room is too hot for the crew to remain inside. In response, the engine room is evacuated and sealed, and the ship's fire system floods the space with carbon dioxide. Despite being starved of oxygen, the fire keeps on burning, piercing deeper into the engine room walls until the flames begin to destroy the ship's wiring. The damage quickly causes electrical systems to malfunction across the vessel. Not long after, the Prinsendam loses power and steering. Meanwhile, the Coast Guard begins organizing a rescue operation. But the ship's location proves problematic for several reasons. To start with, the closest Coast Guard station is more than an hour's flight away, and it only has 2 rescue helicopters available. This is nowhere near enough to evacuate the number of people on the Prinsendam. And even then, air crews will only have a limited time at the ship before having to leave to refuel. To make matters worse, the remnants of a Pacific typhoon are forecast to reach the cruise liner around the same time as the rescuers. According to senior Coast Guard officials, a physically fit adult in their prime might survive for around an hour after falling into the Gulf of Alaska. But the average age of passengers aboard the Prinsendam is 72. This makes the margin for error frighteningly small. Many of these passengers will likely need help just climbing into rescue baskets, let alone doing so from a burning ship with strong winds and heavy swells. So authorities pull in more aircraft from other stations across the region, whose crews face a much longer journey to reach the scene. At the same time, officials search for vessels which are close enough to help. These ships are potentially vital as they can carry far more survivors than helicopters. They can also provide immediate shelter and medical care. One of them is the massive oil tanker Williamsburg, roughly 100 miles south of the Prinsendam. It receives the SOS and immediately turns north to aid the burning vessel. While the rescue effort takes shape, passengers on board the Prinsendam are beginning to realize something's wrong. Below them, heat is escaping through an open shaft, rising toward the upper decks. It superheats the steel structures above, including a kitchen floor area and a room full of linen. At the same time, smoke drifts along corridors that lead to the guest cabins. Several passengers are jolted from sleep after hearing loud noises and movement throughout the ship. Sensing trouble, they immediately put on warm clothes and grab jackets. Others wake more slowly, confused by the smell of smoke and commotion outside their rooms. But once they open their cabin doors, the scale of the problem becomes clear. Thick, black smoke pours in from the hallway. Passengers begin warning one another that there's a fire somewhere on the ship. Within minutes, frightened guests gather outside their rooms, unsure where to go or what to do next.
I saw the crew running up and down the stairs with heavy firefighting equipment. I started to go back for blankets, but there was no way. The smoke was becoming too thick.
With panic spreading fast, Captain Wabeck addresses passengers at around 1 a.m. to control the situation. He tells them there's a small fire in the engine room and asks everyone to leave their cabins and move calmly to the upper promenade deck. But the announcement does little to calm passengers' nerves. Abandoning their possessions, most don't have time to change into outdoor clothing and head to the deck wearing everything from nightgowns to tuxedos. Some only have slippers for foot protection, others are barefoot. Over the next hour, the engineering crews continue trying to contain the blaze below deck, but the reports reaching the bridge kept getting worse. The fire has spread to some of the upper decks, and the damage below is becoming harder to assess. The possibility of losing the engine room prompts officers to order an inspection of the ship. Staff begin checking portholes one by one for damage, making sure they're fully sealed in case the ship begins taking on water. As the crew braces for a worst-case scenario, passengers huddle together in the relative safety of the sheltered promenade sections. But when smoke reaches the lounge, they're forced out onto the exposed deck areas. Many have nothing to protect them from the freezing night air, so they grab sweaters from the gift shop and wrap themselves in curtains and tablecloths taken from the lounge for warmth. Once outside, staff face numerous complaints from guests who weren't warned to prepare for an emergency and now have no way to retrieve valuables or coats. Despite the frustration and suffering from the cold, passengers largely remain calm. Entertainers move through the crowd, singing songs and playing music from the ship's show to boost morale. Together, they wait in the darkness for over an hour as the ship's condition slowly becomes unsustainable. By 3:30 a.m., much of the ship's wiring is burned through. Critically, the firefighting pumps are now offline, cutting off the crew's main supply of pressurized water. Unable to fight the inferno effectively, they also begin retreating to the upper decks, where fresh fires are breaking out in guest rooms and in the main dining areas. Captain Wabeck monitors the situation from the bridge and tells the Coast Guard he's lost most of his ability to fight the blaze. Then he notices that the Prinsendam is developing a starboard lean. The intense heat is shattering the glass portholes. As each one fails, an increasing amount of water pours into the ship's hull. Over the next few hours, Captain Wabeck keeps the Coast Guard updated, informing them that the listing is getting worse. To his relief, the first wave of helicopters is closing in. Authorities have also called in aircraft from Canada and several other merchant vessels. But they, along with the rest of the rescue, including Williamsburg, are still hours away. Even with some help nearby, the Prinsendam's still drifting without power and sitting alarmingly low in the water. After assessing his options, Captain Wabeck decides it's safer for passengers to brave the open ocean than remain on the burning ship. Shortly after 5 a.m., he gives the order to evacuate. For passengers waiting on the deck, it's a surreal moment. Only hours earlier, they had hoped to return to their rooms. Now, crew members are struggling to free lifeboats and ushering people to scramble over the side of the deck into whatever space is available. The scene that follows is anything but organized. Several motorized boats are crammed with far more people than they're supposed to carry, and as space inside them fills, some of the inexperienced crew rush past passengers to secure spots for themselves. Their panic means dozens of elderly guests and families have to board inflatable rafts, a far more exposed route off the ship. The chaos gets even worse when survivors are launched into the water. As the boats are lowered onto the ocean's surface, some have trouble releasing. Dangling from twisted lines, they slam into the burning ship's hull, and several boats are almost lowered directly on top of each other. Eventually, the crew manage to free the life craft. From here, staff are supposed to get survivors clear off the Prinsendam and wait together to be rescued. But in the rough seas, Some of the lifeboat engines fail almost immediately. Others have broken rudders, making steering virtually impossible. Instead of forming a tight group, the overcrowded lifeboats begin drifting apart into the Alaskan darkness. While the evacuation continues, Captain Webeck and a small firefighting crew remain aboard, trying to stabilize the Prinsendam for as long as they can. Senior officers also warn the Coast Guard to be on the lookout for survivors in the water who are suffering from exposure to the cold and could be miles away by the time responders arrive. At daybreak, the first helicopters appear on the horizon. Rescuers spot hundreds of survivors scattered around a thick plume of smoke rising from the remains of the Prinsendam. After taking note of the lifeboat's rough course and location, one of the aircrew members approaches the Prinsendam. Hovering above a deck close to the bridge, a Coast Guard officer with decades of marine firefighting experience is dropped onto the cruise liner. He approaches Captain Webeck, who's frozen in a state of shock. But after the captain regains his senses, they try to come up with a strategy to bring the blaze under control. Between cooling the ship from the outside with a portable pump and trying to vent the fire from the inside, nothing has had a real effect. The Prinsendam's steel structure has become so hot it's borderline unstable, and salvaging the ship is becoming increasingly unlikely. So they decided it's time to evacuate the remaining crew. But most of the lifeboats have already been launched, and helicopters can only carry a few people at a time to a staging area back on land. Until one of the ships joins the rescue, both passengers in the water and the Coast Guard are effectively in limbo. Fortunately, the Williamsburg is moving at full throttle, and it arrives at the scene just over an hour later. The lifeboats with working engines immediately head towards the tanker, where the Williamsburg crew helps survivors climb rope ladders up to the safety of its deck. At the same time, helicopters start ferrying survivors from waterlogged boats and those without steering to the tanker. But they have to change tactics when the wind from the helicopter rotors nearly capsizes the inflatable rafts. In response, the Williamsburg crew springs into action. Using a lifeboat as a shuttle, they transport people trapped in immobile rafts back to their vessel. And once aboard the tanker, it's clear many of the passengers couldn't have lasted much longer. Most are suffering from seasickness, exposure to the cold, and even hypothermia. The worst affected are flown to hospitals for immediate medical attention. Everyone else receives dry clothes, warm shelter, and a comforting hot meal on the Williamsburg. But around half of the Prinsendam survivors are still stuck at sea. Over the next 4 hours, helicopters, planes, and a second large vessel join the rescue effort from surrounding regions. Working together, they communicate to locate the remaining lifeboats, rotating the helicopters as they return to land to drop off survivors and refuel. Responders already face a race against time before the remaining passengers collapse from exhaustion. Then another factor increases the need for urgency. As expected, the tail end of the Pacific typhoon is moving across the area, and the weather is deteriorating as it advances. By early afternoon, rising wind speeds and waves reaching 9 meters tall force the Williamsburg crew back to their ship. From this point onward, survivors are mainly reliant on air crews being able to lift them to safety and help them climb into nearby ships. But by 4:30 p.m., the helicopters are struggling to cope with the strong winds. As far as everyone can tell, only one lifeboat is left in the water, and getting to the boat is becoming harder by the minute. With a few hours of sunlight remaining, all hands rush to transfer the survivors before flying becomes impossible. In the early evening, it looks like the rescue is over. All 519 survivors are believed to be accounted for, spread across the Williamsburg, another vessel, and the aircraft which carried the most serious medical cases towards land. Back on the Prinsendam, Captain Webeck receives the news that it looks like everyone's made it to safety. The same can't be said of his vessel. Portable firefighting equipment has failed to extinguish the blaze, and the bridge itself is no longer safe. As the Prinsendam rolls in heavy seas, a Coast Guard helicopter lifts the captain away from the deck. Moments later, flames appear in the wheelhouse windows. After 15 years of service, the captain is lowered onto the deck of a tanker and turns to salute what was once his second home. Meanwhile, responders begin a messy head-counting process when a problem emerges. According to the Prinsendam's log, some of the crew's entertainers and other staff aren't clearly listed with the main passengers and crew. Worryingly, they also realize 2 Air Force personnel are missing. The pair were last spotted earlier that afternoon being lowered into a lifeboat, but their helicopter had to make an emergency landing on a ship when the gusts picked up. In the confusion that followed, the group of survivors they were helping had been overlooked. It took until after midnight for the rescue to restart. Only this time, it was without aircraft, as they'd returned to their bases. So the search fell to 2 cutters, who scanned the lifeboat's last known locations using spotlights to pierce into the pitch-black night. Within 45 minutes, a flare shoots into the air from the missing lifeboat. Inside are the Air Force crew and 18 other survivors, huddled together for warmth. They've spent more than 20 hours exposed to the elements. Although none of them have serious injuries, some are in an advanced state of hypothermia. Fortunately, the survivors have been found just before their condition is irreversible. After recovering with the aid of doctors, rescuers can breathe a sigh of relief. They've just completed the largest air-to-sea rescue in modern history, and it's an astonishing success. But the Prinsendam is in an awful state. Over the next 24 hours, the fire aboard the ship petered out while survivors were transported back to land. With the blaze extinguished, Holland America still hopes to salvage the cruise liner, and at first, it seemed possible. A Canadian tugboat reached the 427-foot vessel, intending to pull it to Oregon for repairs. But that changed a few days later when fresh fires started at hotspots inside the abandoned ship. As the flames erupted, they blew out portholes, allowing more seawater to enter the Prinsendam's hull. From that point onward, the ship struggled to stay afloat. Over the next 72 hours, the vessel was reduced to a burning shell. Eventually, the bridge came close to collapsing, and the ship's listing became even worse as the lower decks disappeared beneath the water. Eventually, the tug was forced to slow to a crawl as the Prinsendam reached the point of no return. In the early hours of October 11th, the burnt-out cruise liner rolled onto its starboard side. It slipped beneath the surface in just 3 minutes, sinking to the muddy seafloor around 2,700 meters below. The Prinsendam was only 7 years old when it sank, and the loss of such a modern passenger ship raised uncomfortable questions about the industry's safety. Because the vessel was registered in Netherlands territory and the fire happened in international waters, the investigation fell to Dutch authorities. It would take more than a year before they published their findings. On paper, authorities found that the Prinsendam was a seaworthy vessel. It had passed inspections by the U.S. Coast Guard and met Dutch construction standards of the time. Alarmingly, the ship also met fire protection criteria, even though this was the 3rd blaze in its short lifespan. With no obvious design flaws, investigators traced the fire to an unexpected component failure near engine number 2. The exact malfunction is debated, but officials suspected that a defective bolt may have allowed fuel to leak from a cylinder connection. Once the leak began, fuel sprayed across the engine room under pressure, allowing it to make contact with a hot exhaust pipe. Under ordinary circumstances, a hot surface would have been protected by insulation material, but the investigations found that insulation around the pipe had been removed during earlier repairs and apparently was never replaced. Although the exposed pipe helped the fuel ignite, investigators argued that senior leadership still had a chance to stop the fire before it destroyed the ship. According to the report, the immediate priority should have been cutting off the fuel supply completely. Instead, officers stopped the Prinsendam's engines without realizing a booster pump was still feeding fuel into the line, and left the junior crew in a futile position, trying to stop the blaze with handheld extinguishers. Senior staff also came under criticism for the delay in using the ship's main engine room fire suppression system. Unlike sprinklers, the system worked by flooding a sealed space with CO2 and starving the fire of oxygen. But it needed to be used quickly, before the fire grew too hot or beyond the initial breakout area. Instead of acting immediately, Captain Webeck and his staff spent around 45 minutes trying to understand the scope of the fire. By the time they triggered the CO2 system, the blaze was far too large for the system to extinguish. The lack of urgency typified the performance of senior officers. Captain Webeck in particular faced backlash for his reluctance to send the full SOS, and for failing to ensure that all air vents were fully closed, which, at the very least, could have slowed the fire's spread. After weighing the evidence, the courts ruled that none of the maintenance staff were responsible for the initial fire breakout. Officials also argued that the disaster could have been far worse if it wasn't for the chief radio officer. His decision to ignore the captain's orders and send the full SOS saw him honored with a national award by the Queen of the Netherlands. The same couldn't be said of Captain Webeck and several of the Prinsendam senior officers, who had their licenses suspended for their handling of the fire. Although the longest ban was only for 2 months, it placed lasting damage on their reputations at sea. Following the punishments, Holland America defended the design of Prinsendam and continued operating cruises along the Alaskan coast. The company remains active today as a subsidiary of Carnival Cruise Line. Meanwhile, the rescue operation received widespread praise and letters of thanks from survivors, and went to be known as the Miracle at Sea. Thanks to the joint effort of commercial, military, and Coast Guard personnel, all 519 people were brought to safety without a single death or major injury. If you found this video interesting, please consider subscribing to catch more of our videos.